Good morning. I'm Patrick Lewis, the Director of Collections and Research at the Filson Historical Society. I'm so glad that you joined us for this presentation in our 2021 Biennial Conference, 1946 Reconsidered, the Post-World War II Ohio Valley. I'd like to take this opportunity to again thank our event sponsors, the CE&S Foundation, and an anonymous friend of the Filson. The work of organizing these sessions and following them up with peer-reviewed publications, further study, and public conversation would have been impossible without their support. Thank you again for joining us for this morning's presentation, The Heart of the American Bomb, Building the Atomic Valley. Jason Krupar is an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of Cincinnati. He joined the history department in March 2010. Prior to that, he was a faculty member in the Department of Humanities, Media, and Cultural Studies at the OMI College of Applied Science at the University of Cincinnati for 8 years. He specializes in technology and engineering, policy histories, Cold War history, 20th century American history, historic preservation, and the history of the Manhattan Project. I'll return to moderate questions after the presentation as time permits. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jason Krupar.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank all of you who are attending this morning's conference, and also thank the Filson Center for putting this together. Today I'll be talking about the heart of the American bomb, building the atomic valley, and I hope to be able to get through this in about 45 minutes and hopefully still have time for your questions afterwards. America's Cold War atomic heartland began when the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission expanded the toehold established in the region by its predecessor, the Manhattan Engineer District. Next slide, please. The wartime Manhattan Project came to Ohio seeking to employ the expertise in chemical engineering and processing concentrated in Dayton by the Monsanto Corporation. While considered by many historians as a secondary laboratory and production site, the Dayton Project actually served a rather critical function in the bomb assembly system that stretched across the country during the project. Polonium initiators were needed for the atomic bombs being designed and manufactured by the MED, particularly the Fat Man plutonium implosion bomb model. The Dayton Project centralized polonium production in one location for the bomb project. Once operations started in Dayton, though, the project and later the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission repeatedly returned the Ohio River Valley region to construct additional laboratory and fabrication facilities. Next slide, please. The atomic valley, as I've come to define it, stretched from Paducah, Kentucky to Portsmouth, Ohio, and included several tributaries of the Ohio River, the Great Miami River, the Scioto River, the Little Scioto, and the facilities that were going to be built along those waterways. Starting in 1947, the AEC identified this region as one of the safest areas to build and operate key fabrication centers and research laboratories critical to the growing nuclear arsenal that the country was putting together. The U.S. Department of Defense deemed the region outside the range of Soviet bombers. The commission took advantage of the industrial and technological expertise found in the region's labor force, the transportation and natural resources readily available, the large established population centers on both sides of the Ohio River, Cincinnati, Louisville, for example, and the nearly unwavering patriotism displayed by communities clamoring for consideration for these federal facilities. Local politicians, community boosters, union leaders, newspaper editors in the valley competed to secure AEC plant sites in what many at the time described as America's new atomic Ruhr Valley. Next slide, please. Few histories consider the creation of the atomic valley, despite possessing what I consider one of the highest concentrations of nuclear weapons production sites and laboratories in the national arsenal. Historians instead have focused on the wartime Manhattan Project marquee sites, Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford, and have not really paid much attention to the Cold War atomic manufacturing and laboratory complex, let alone the atomic valley. I intend to rectify that situation, not only with this presentation, but also in later publications I'm working on. The Atomic Energy Commission rapidly expanded, streamlined, and modernized the embryonic project era plants and labs into a vast system of facilities capable of mass producing nuclear warheads. Many people tend to forget that the Manhattan Project, as large as it was, as upscaled as it was from the research that had been done in the 1930s, a lot of the work that was being done within manufacturing work being done within the Manhattan Project was still almost being done by hand. In order to build up the arsenal as rapidly as it was expected to be able to, with the demands coming from the Department of Defense, the AEC needed to basically modernize and mass produce weapons, warheads, and the means of production. And that's what we will see happening from the late 40s through the 1950s. Little has been written about how the commission accomplished this and the ramifications of these achievements. Investigating the Atomic Valley presents an opportunity to look at not one solitary site, but several purposely concentrated in the same region. Typical histories concerning America's atomic arsenal focus on a specific plant or laboratory site. Many treat AEC sites, whether production facilities or laboratories, as isolated federal enclaves linked bureaucratically to the commission's headquarters in Germantown, Maryland. A few histories incorporated a broader perspective using a regional approach to understand how individual commission facilities acted as more than just remote federal outposts. A regional approach provides the chance to contextualize how AEC sites were selected and related to local conditions and populations. And I plan to use such an approach in examining the Atomic Valley sites. Next slide, please. The passage of the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, and since we are talking about that pivotal year of 1946 at this conference, that passage of that act is very important to the history of the arsenal and also for the Atomic Valley. The passage of that act placed the responsibility of maintaining and expanding America's nuclear arsenal in the hands of a civilian agency that inherited the personnel and policies from the Manhattan Project. Cold War pressures necessitated the rapid enlargement and retooling of the existing bomb production infrastructure. Meeting production quota demands from the Department of Defense required the AEC to identify candidate locations, select final sites, and build new facilities across the country. The commissioners, their subordinates, the contractors, modified production site criteria to save money, initiate operations faster at new plants, and to take full advantage of regional resources. The AEC deliberately placed its facilities in the Ohio River Valley within 20 miles or less of existing populations. And you see that over and over again with the examples we'll be talking about today. Next slide, please. Constructing and operating atomic arsenal units so close to established communities departed from existing criteria inherited from the Manhattan Project. Access to natural resources, available transportation systems such as rail, highway, plane, plenty of electricity for site operations, and isolation from pre-existing large populations served as key factors in determining locations by MED and contractor surveyors. Brigadier General Leslie Groves, the Manhattan Project director, and his subordinates concentrated a great deal of attention on site remoteness when evaluating locations. Isolation, I addressed two primary worries held by Groves: security and safety. Isolation generated an issue that bedeviled Groves and MED leaders: the necessity of establishing government-owned towns. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Los Alamos, New Mexico, and Richland, Washington all started as wholly government-maintained communities, not only during the Manhattan Project, but all three of them remained government-owned and operated communities into the early 1950s. This cost the project a great deal of money. It also cost the Atomic Energy Commission a lot of money, and for the Atomic Energy Commission, a lot of political headache. In seeking to isolate production sites, Groves and project personnel dispensed with the common practice of constructing large industrial facilities near adequate housing, services, and skilled labor pools. That had always been the tradition. But with the coming of the project, the necessity of security, the fears of what could happen if you have a catastrophic accident happening either at Oak Ridge or at Hanford with the plutonium production reactors there, that whole notion gets flipped upside down. Instead, we're all about isolation, security, remoteness. Next slide, please. When Congress passed the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, and President Harry S. Truman signed it, Groves and the Army Corps of Engineers transferred ownership of the MED's weapons complex over to the Atomic Energy Commission. The AEC inherited not only the physical plan of the project, but also its personnel, its attitudes, and its policies, including site selection. The commissioners hope to make the transition from MED to civil service as painless as possible in order to maintain production schedules and morale. However, the expectations placed upon the agency expanded as the Cold War hostilities accelerated and the reliance on nuclear deterrence continued to grow. The commission entered into an expansion period in 1947 that really doesn't end until 1952. During those years, the AEC transformed the hastily assembled production lines of the project into a transcontinental manufacturing system, along with significant changes in site criteria. The applications of these new guidelines contributed to the placement of fabrication plants near large population concentrations in the Ohio River Valley. Next slide. The bomb came to the Ohio River via Project Y, or Los Alamos Laboratory, although the foundations of the region's involvement can be traced back further. Critical to the later establishment of the Dayton project was the creation of the Thomas and Hochwalt Laboratories in 1926. Founded by Charles Allen Thomas and Carol A. Hochwalt, the research successes of this company attracted the attention of Monsanto Chemical Corporation. Monsanto purchases the firm in 1936 for $1.4 million in common shares of Monsanto stock. Thomas would go on to become director of the Central Research Department for Monsanto, and Hochwalt assumed leadership of the Dayton facilities. They make for a very good team, and it actually does make for a very good marriage between the Thomas and Hochwalt firm and Monsanto. The coming of World War II brought the company and both men eventually into the Manhattan Project. Next slide, please. So Monsanto and Thomas are both going to be recruited to participate in the Manhattan Project by early 1943. Dayton will become the focal point of polonium production for the project by the summer of '43. The reason why we're talking about polonium is going to be used as the initiator. A combination of polonium, radium, along with beryllium are going to be used as the initiator for the plutonium implosion bomb, the Fat Man bomb design, which will become pretty much the standard of America's atomic arsenal in the late 40s into the 50s. So Charles Allen Thomas had become well known throughout the scientific world, at least in the US, for the research that he and his company had been able to do at Dayton, with both on their own and then with Monsanto. That gets the attention of some key individuals, including General Leslie Groves. Dayton is going to become a secondary site, I guess would call it. It's not a primary like Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, or Hanford, but Dayton will have multiple improvised sites that will be established that will be primarily focused on research and producing polonium for the Manhattan Project. The largest of these sites is going to be known as Unit 4. This is otherwise known as the Runnymede Playhouse, located in the Dayton suburb of Oakwood. The image to your right there is what it looked like before it became a production and research facility. One of the ironies of the Playhouse becoming a scene of research and production is the Playhouse was actually owned by Thomas's in-laws. It was part of their estate at one point. Polonium manufacturing will begin at Unit 4 in 1944. There had been promises made to the suburb of Oakwood that after the emergency, the wartime emergency had ended, that cleanup would happen at the Playhouse, and the Playhouse would be returned to the community and continue to be used by the community for various events and whatnot. That unfortunately does not happen. Next slide, please. MED officials started to consider building a new polonium facility in late 1945. The improvised facilities that are scattered throughout Dayton are just not sufficient. Project officials considered constructing a new plant at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and then they ran into a problem. They did an informal survey of the Dayton staff, and by far, most of the Dayton staff refused to move to Tennessee. The MED did not want to lose the expertise that had been gained with the staff in Dayton, and so they turned away from the idea of building a new facility at Oak Ridge, but they still needed to find a location for this new facility. Dayton Monsanto personnel will actually be involved in the process of looking for a new site. They'll examine locations around the greater Dayton area and make a final recommendation and selection in July of 1946. And the final site lay about 10 miles south of Dayton in Miamisburg. This will become known as Mound, named after the fairly large Native American mound, literally right next to the site. This will become the nation's first permanent atomic facility and known initially as Unit 5, and then later officially it will become Mound Laboratory. Next slide. Already talked a little bit about the Atomic Energy Act of 46, but this is kind of a turning point because we go from a military supervised and controlled project to what is now going to be a civilian supervised U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. And it will assume all management for all of the nuclear research laboratories, production plants, testing sites, everything, January 1st, 1947. So Mound Laboratory starts off as a project era facility. I mean, it was selected when the Manhattan Project was still in control of the atom, and then it becomes the AEC's first completed facility. So it's a transitional facility. Next slide. While work proceeded on the Miamisburg Center, the newly created AEC commissioners in early 47 decided to enhance the nation's polonium and initiator supply chain by seeking a second production site. And this actually follows in line with what becomes a pattern for the AEC, always having duplicate backup facilities throughout the complex. Limiting polonium processing and initiator manufacturing to Mound without a backup created a vulnerability in the weapons complex that needed to be overcome. The desire to disperse atomic production plants for security and defensive reasons influenced site selection. A second polonium processing line needed to be located far enough away from Miamisburg to satisfy this dispersal concern. So if you took out Miamisburg, you also didn't take out the backup, yet in close proximity to permit Monsanto personnel to coordinate operations at the two facilities. The initial candidate site was the Jefferson Proving Ground near Madison, Indiana. Further investigation by Monsanto personnel and by AEC officials revealed that there were going to be too many problems with the Jefferson Proving Ground location, chiefly sharing the proving ground with the military. That created too many conflicts. So the Jefferson Proving Ground was abandoned. A second search is done, and the finalist will be the Scioto Ordnance Works in Marion, Ohio. One of the reasons why the Marion, Ohio site is selected is the fact it's near the little Scioto River. Having a water supply for any of these sites is always attractive. Keep in mind the little Scioto feeds into the Scioto River, which also feeds into the Ohio, so it's part of that watershed. Next slide, please. The AEC determined in 49 that the existing system of processing uranium feed materials presented an obstacle to the rising production quotas that the DoD was demanding. While the widespread uranium milling and refining operations between St. Louis, Cleveland, and Niagara Falls followed the Commission's dispersal policy, inefficiencies at those facilities themselves caused problems. The commissioners authorized the New York Operations Office to design an integrated plant capable of coordinating or conducting all phases of refining and processing work in one facility. The initial search began in 1950. That will end actually in failure since most of the recommended sites were likely to be reactivated by the Army due to the Korean War. What they're looking at is already owned ordnance works depots, facilities already owned by the federal government. And with the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, most of those sites that the AEC had considered at that time looked as though they were going to be reactivated due to the conflict. A second search is conducted, and that will end up with a final site being selected, which is now known as the Frenald Uranium Feed Materials Facility. Next slide, please. The Frenald site, located less than 20 miles northwest of downtown Cincinnati. Residents living in the southeast Ohio hamlets of Ross, Frenald, and Shandon received news March 30th, 1951, that they had been selected. The AEC announced its intentions to acquire more than 1,050 acres in the area to construct a new atomic plant. The Cincinnati Enquirer informed readers the next day that Frenald's selection so near the city, quote, should allay the fears of atomic bomb conscious Cincinnatians rather than add to them. The Enquirer reporter Hale Metziger Jr. added that the commission's decision to build at Cincinnati, quote, is in what the Department of Defense calls a preferential geographic area, a zone that could be defended from possible enemy attack, end quote. And next slide, please. So Frenald gets selected, 18 to 20 miles northwest of Cincinnati, another site adding to the construction of the Atomic Valley. A joint AEC and Department of Defense team determined in the summer of 1950, this is along with working on what's happening up at Scioto, what's now happening over at Frenald. We have another team in the summer of 1950 that determines that the massive K-25 gaseous diffusion plant that had been built during the Manhattan Project at Oak Ridge could not keep up with the rising production quotas. The team reported that an additional gaseous or several additional gaseous diffusion plants would be needed by 1953. That same group argued in its September 1950 report that the, quote, initial and major portions of the new capacity should be located at a site, end quote, away from Oak Ridge for strategic and power supply reasons. This is, again, part of that dispersal pattern that the AEC is following. This recommendation followed the Commission's policies of dispersing and duplicating facilities. The deadline for acquiring a new site was set for December 1st, 1950. The AEC team from Oak Ridge was delegated the task of selecting a site. The investigators only considered government-owned properties within 8 identified regions, one of them being the Ohio Valley. The commission leadership believed that focusing on federally owned land saved time and avoided condemnation proceedings, which seemed to always generate negative public attention. That, of course, is an understatement. Every time the government, whether it was during the Manhattan Project or the AEC, had to condemn land, there was always opposition and lawsuits. And in some cases, the federal government ended up having to pay higher prices for the real estate that they were acquiring than they had wanted. Groves, for example, was known to complain bitterly about having to pay higher prices for the land that the project had to acquire for Hanford than he had initially intended. Other factors that the team considered included a continuous supply of water, existing housing for the anticipated 1,500 operations personnel and their families, no history of major natural disasters, proximity to adequate transportation systems, a good labor market with skilled tradesmen, low labor costs, and available inexpensive, cheap land. Next slide. The AEC personnel on the team visited 19 sites, narrowed the finalists down to 3, which best fulfilled the most requirements. And the 3 sites included the Kentucky Ordnance Works at Paducah, the Louisiana Ordnance Plant at Shreveport, and the Longhorn Ordnance Works in Marshall, Texas. And the site that most fulfilled the requirements was the Kentucky Ordnance Works. It's located about 15 miles west of Paducah near the Ohio River. And the plant, or what the AEC would eventually acquire, was 750 acres. That was the actual plant site of a total of 3,556 acres. There's a buffer zone that would be acquired around that plant site. While initially welcomed and seen as an economic boon for the immediate area, the construction of the gaseous diffusion plant and the 2 accompanying coal-fired power stations would cause headaches for residents. Wildcat strikes plagued all 3 work sites as unions struck over pay and jurisdiction. Housing shortages occurred as well. Additionally, there is a complicated political tug-of-war that will break out over who would build and operate the 2 power stations. A privately owned Electric Energy Inc. or the Tennessee Valley Authority, and eventually both of them will get the contracts to oversee the construction and operation at the power stations. The TVA will oversee the construction and operation of what becomes known as the Shawnee Point Power Station, and the Electric Energy Incorporated will oversee the construction of the plant at Jopa, Illinois, across the river from Paducah. Next slide, please. The successful placement of a gaseous diffusion plant at Paducah and pressures from the military and Congress to increase the nation's nuclear capability would lead the commissioners to start the selection of a second gaseous diffusion site in 1951. Stone and Webster Engineering Corporation was hired to do the surveying. By December of 1951, that survey team had narrowed the search down to 3 locations in the Ohio River region: Louisville, Portsmouth, Chillicothe, and Ashland, Kentucky, Parkersburg, West Virginia. Stone and Webster's second phase survey resulted in 3 finalists, and this is in order of preference: Louisville, Cincinnati, and Portsmouth. And Portsmouth was viewed as a distant third option. The proposed Louisville site was located in eastern Jefferson County, near the western portion of Oldham County, 2 miles from a residential area, 3 miles from the Standard Golf and Country Club. And the AEC actually, they didn't think that there was any problem with this location. So they were woefully unprepared for the outcry of opposition that will spring up in Louisville. The Louisville Chamber of Commerce opposed the selection of their city for the next AEC plant. The board of directors for the Chamber of Commerce wrote and voted on a resolution March 18th, 1952 that opposed the selection and laid out 6 rationales for the chamber's position. And these included infrastructure burdens, population increases, high employment already in the area stretching the labor pool, concerns over possible residential expansion eastward now being blocked, industrial expansions in Louisville already overwhelming the city. Those were some of the primary rationales for why the board of directors opposed the idea of the AEC placing its second gaseous diffusion plant in the greater Louisville area. Next slide. So the fact that Louisville says no, and that it's the business community saying no, takes the commissioners by surprise. Rayburn Watkins, who's the administrative secretary of the Louisville Chamber of Commerce, informed Gordon Dean. Gordon Dean is the second chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. Informed Gordon Dean and the other commissioners that, quote, the local population was vehemently opposed to the construction of an atomic plant in the area, end quote. The actions of the Louisville Chamber of Commerce motivated other local communities in the area to oppose the selection. Pewee Valley, Crestwood, Anchorage, Worthington, all come out against the idea of having an AEC facility in their immediate region. Unsurprisingly, I suppose, local unions supported Louisville's selection. And so you have this fight playing out in the Louisville newspapers about supporting or not supporting the selection of Louisville for the Atomic Energy Commission facility. Ultimately, the AEC will abandon Louisville. It becomes too much of a headache. There's just too much opposition, especially coming from the business community. And so the Atomic Energy Commission will turn to its second choice, Cincinnati. Cincinnati, though, is not an optimal candidate either. Frenald was experiencing labor issues over double time pay for second shift work. There had been work stoppages already happening at Frenald. The Cincinnati location that the AEC was considering was near Okeana, which I understand to be, at least at the time, was a little community up in Butler County. So it was about 25 miles northwest of the city in Butler County. So it'd be on the west side of the city, It would have been northwest of present where Frenald was built. The Cincinnati Chamber of Commerce, likely inspired by what was happening down at Louisville, raised questions similar to what the Louisville Chamber of Commerce had issued and had publicized. And in April 4th, 1952, the Inquirer reported quite prominently that a number of business leaders had met with AEC officials to state that locating the new plant in Cincinnati would, quote, would drain much of the manpower necessary to carry on the heavy defense work already under contract. And so what they're basically talking about is you've already got us working on, we already have Frenald here. We've got the big GE jet engine facility here. We've got Procter & Gamble. We've already got a labor pool here that we think is already stretched. And now you want to add another facility here. We just can't support that. So partially inspired by Louisville, Cincinnati grows opposition and starts to question whether or not this facility should be built in the Cincinnati greater area. Next slide, please. So confronted with the unexpected opposition from Louisville and now Cincinnati, the AEC will turn to Portsmouth. And again, Portsmouth was a distant third choice for this new second gaseous diffusion plant. At the time, Portsmouth, compared to other cities along the Ohio, was somewhat economically depressed. That made local unions a bit more amenable to the wages and pay scales being offered by the commission. Several delegations from Portsmouth will visit the AEC and will speak with the commissioners. Gordon Dean reported late May 52 to Marion Bauer, who was the AEC general manager at the time, that, quote, another delegation of extremely enthusiastic citizens of Portsmouth, Ohio, visited me this morning, end quote. So there seemed to be more enthusiasm, more support, more willingness to embrace having a facility at Portsmouth than anywhere else along the river at the time. The local craft unions agreed not to demand the high premiums for second shift work as Cincinnati had, and to resolve any future demands, except for general wage increases without striking. So promises essentially not to strike. These promises made Portsmouth highly attractive for the AEC. The AEC had already experienced wage issues, labor strikes, not only at Frenald, but down at Paducah. There had been the threat of strikes up at Mound even earlier. So having a local union delegates promising that their membership would not go on strike really made Portsmouth attractive and raised it from a distant third to becoming the site for the second gaseous diffusion plant. Labor problems will continue at Frenald in the summer of 52. That will basically convince the commissioners that we need to build this facility at Portsmouth. Louisville's already turned us down. We were hoping maybe we could build at Cincinnati, but with the continual labor headaches, we're going to have to abandon that. And so Portsmouth will be selected. Condemnation procedures and purchasing of land will begin shortly after that. By June of 1953, the AEC had acquired 2,701 acres and started construction that December for the new facility. So when the second gaseous diffusion plant at Portsmouth comes online, I mean, that will bring to an end the construction of facilities in the valley. But by that point, you will have already had Miamisburg, Mound being built. You've got Scioto Laboratory. You have Frenald uranium feed materials facility. You've got the Paducah gaseous diffusion plant site, and then you have Portsmouth. Just like with Paducah, Portsmouth will require the construction of two large coal-fired power stations. One will be built at Madison or near Madison, Indiana, and the other one will be built near Gallipolis, Ohio. Those will both be operated by the Ohio Valley Electrical consortium, which is still around today, and so are those power stations, although their usefulness for the Portsmouth facility has been negated since Portsmouth has been closed and is now in the process of being cleaned up. Next slide, please. So some conclusions. The AEC completed the construction of the Atomic Valley by the late 1950s. The safety of the area promised, according to the Defense Department, had effectively been neutralized by that point by the arrival of intercontinental missile technologies. One of the reasons why the AEC agreed to concentrate, or was attracted to concentrating facilities in the Ohio Valley, was that it was out of range of Soviet bombers. Missile technology will completely overwhelm that. Massive monetary investments made by the federal government in building the Atomic Valley ensured that the fabrication plants and laboratories were unlikely to be moved anytime soon. Millions will have already been poured in to building and operating those facilities by the time the safety had been neutralized with the arrival of missile technologies. Communities throughout the valley will come to depend upon the AEC sites as reliable sources of local employment. While the secrecy surrounding the facilities or their locations close to population centers allowed the sites to hide in the industrialism of the region for nearly 40 years. These sites, people knew of the existence of these sites, maybe not the particulars of what they were doing in terms of production at the sites, but the fact that they were so close to Paducah, to Dayton, to Cincinnati, to Portsmouth, meant that the local populations were aware of the existence of the plants, maybe not the particulars of what they were producing or what they were researching, but they were there, they were a presence. This is different than what happened with the Manhattan Project sites of Hanford, Oak Ridge, and Los Alamos, where not a lot of people knew where they were, or let alone what they were actually producing or researching. When the Cold War ended, the true cost of operating a nationwide nuclear weapons fabrication system comes into focus for the American public and for Valley residents in particular. We are still in the process of cleaning up, remediating, dealing with the long-term legacies of what these sites brought to the Ohio Valley, to the Atomic Valley region. There are environmental issues we're still dealing with. There are health issues. So there will continue to be costs incurred because of the 40 plus years of the operations of these facilities. And I think I will end on that.
Well, thanks so much. That was that was absolutely fascinating and really incredible. And I think that's really the important point about this work. And I feel like this conference in particular, the themes that we're trying to draw out here, in this post-war moment, we build an infrastructure that most of us have taken for granted. We've grown up with it, we've lived with it in our cities, in our suburbs, and it's sort of become part of the fabric of life. And so it's almost invisible. And so the deep roots and the huge federal investment that goes in here is practically it's intangible anywhere you go.
True.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that idea of hiding within the industrialism that builds up around these areas, and talk about maybe what are some of the remnants of these that are still active, or sites that are still around that, like we can almost go play Cold War tourism in our own backyard.
Well, actually we could, because Frenald, let's take Frenald for example. Frenald shut down operations back in the 90s. It's been remediated, it's been cleaned up. It's now the Frenald Nature Preserve or Wildlife Preserve, something like that. There is still a Department of Energy presence out there. There is an interpretation center out there that was actually designed by UC students from our DAP college. There's hiking trails out there, which is a little bit weird. And there's also a very large mound. It's not an Indian mound. It's not a Native American burial mound. It's a mound which has all of the low-level waste that was deemed safe enough to leave on site. which will be there forever. So if you go to Frenald, to the interpretation center, it'll take you through some of the history of what happened there, why Frenald, and then the operations, and of course what happened in the late 80s when the true costs started coming to the surface, the contamination of groundwater, off-site contamination, and then the cleanup. So that would be one place to go. I mean, it's a very nice center. It's been open for at least the last, I think it opened up in 2008 was when the center officially opened up. There is a museum up in Miamisburg at the Mound site, which is affiliated, I believe, with the larger Dayton Museum. What is that? The not the Dayton Historical Society, but the Dayton, and I am blanking on this, I'm very sorry. The Living History Museum center up there in Dayton, which I'm blanking on. So there is a nice museum that's been put together up there at Mound that you can go to, and it will talk about what happened at Mound, the operations there. Portsmouth has a virtual museum you can go online and visit. They're still doing remediation and cleanup at the Portsmouth facility. And then Paducah also has a website, but Paducah, I think Paducah is it on standby? They haven't started cleaning up Paducah, I don't believe. But Paducah does have, in fact, one of the images, if you go back up to the images to slide 15, there's a very nice, Paducah has a flood wall, and one of the panels on the flood wall, is devoted to the Atomic City mural, as they call it. And that is it's a mural that shows the Paducah complex, the gaseous diffusion complex. It also has in the distance, which I thought was quite interesting, they included what I think is the Shawnee Point power plant run by the TVA. I don't know if Paducah actually has a physical museum yet. I'm assuming when they start doing cleanup and remediation there, they'll have some type of facility there that people can visit. So there are places you can go. Scioto Labs doesn't have anything. Part of the reason why Scioto Labs doesn't have anything is Scioto Laboratory, even though a great deal of money was put into building it, was never actually activated. So almost as soon as Scioto Laboratory was completed and staffed, it went into standby status. It remained in standby until about the late 50s, early 60s, and then it was the AC deemed it was unnecessary to have it and got rid of it, sold it off, and that was the end of that. The Dayton project, there was an effort when the National Park Service was creating the Manhattan Project National Park. There was an effort to include the Dayton project in that, and it got dropped. But there was an early effort to include the Dayton project in that. I believe there is signage, historical markers up there in Dayton for some of the locations. Maybe not for every one of them, but for a couple of them up there. So there is some. You could do a tour, I suppose. There are some remnants. At least there are some museums or interpretation centers that one could go to. To your first half of the question about the hiding in sight, I mean, that is one of the fascinating things about what happens here in the Atomic Valley, is that these facilities are built close to major population centers. I mean, most of them are within 20 miles or less. That's publicized that these facilities are being built. I mean, that's the other thing that I find fascinating about this, looking at the Atomic Valley, is that, during the war, if you had publicized anything about Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Hanford, or anything about atomic, nuclear, plutonium, uranium, you would have had FBI and Manhattan Project security officials knocking on your door. But during the Cold War, we're not at war really, So you could publicize, you could talk about this. And in fact, in some ways, the AEC is encouraging this, because if you have people talking about this and thinking this is a great idea, so this will help the local economy, this will help the labor unions, that is good for the AEC. I mean, we build up support, boosterism. It's also, if you think about it, an unofficial way to recruit uh, workers for your sites, because now these articles that are being circulated, because many of these are being circulated through the Associated Press system, they're reaching a larger and larger audience. So workers now know, okay, there are jobs available down in Paducah, there are jobs available at Portsmouth. So there's a greater publication than ever. I wanted to include an image of a great map I found from, I think it was either the Louisville Journal, maybe it was from the Paducah newspaper, that showed, and this was hard to believe, it actually is a map that shows the entire Ohio Valley with all of the sites I just went over marked out on the map. So it has the Paducah plant, it has Frenald, it's got Mound, it's got Portsmouth, even I think has the power plants. And, if you'd been a Soviet saboteur, that would have been a great map to have, because now you have a layout of where all the major sites and secondary sites are for all these facilities. And yet they're publicizing. It was on I think it was on the front page. And I have to go back and see if I can find that. It was a great map, and I couldn't quite figure out how to get it out of the folder I had it in, the file I had it in. There's something else that needs to be said as well. It's not just that these sites are being built and operated by major contractors. It's also the subcontractors that get drawn into these facilities. So Frenald is being operated by National Lead of Ohio. National Lead of Ohio and the Atomic Energy Commission will subcontract work out to subcontractors up in Dayton, Hamilton, Ohio, and here in Cincinnati. For example, LeBlanc, let's see, it's LeBlanc Machine Company. I know I'm getting the company name butchered, but LeBlanc Machine Company here in Cincinnati, where the present Rookwood Mall is. LeBlanc was contracted by National Lead of Ohio to test machinery, new machinery on raw uranium ore at one point. The Cincinnati Millicron, one of the major manufacturers of machine tools, is also contracted by National Lead to do work, subcontract work. And there's a whole another sublayer, a network of contractors and subcontractors around the greater Cincinnati, Hamilton area that all end up doing work at times in the 50s, even into the early 60s. For National Lead and for the AEC, all connected to Frenald. It further integrates these facilities into the local economy, into the local industrial base of the region by doing that. And I'm sure I haven't had a chance to look at other sites, but I'm sure I'll find something similar looking at Portsmouth, looking at Paducah, Mound, that they're all doing subcontract work. They're hiring out subcontractors to do work, and that just further integrates and blends these facilities into the local industrial landscape. And that's something else to think about, that while everyone knows these facilities are there, they may not know what they're doing, but they all know that they're there, and they all know that there are good paying jobs that these facilities offer. I've had, over the years teaching at UC, I've had students whose families come from the west side of Cincinnati who have, when I teach a class on nuclear history, some of these students have either during class or after class have come up to tell me that they had, family members, an uncle, a great uncle, or a grandfather that had worked out there at Frenald, or had maybe worked at one of the subcontractors, maybe up at Hamilton. So they knew that, there was something going out there. And they also would tell me pretty much that those were good paying jobs, that, their relative had been there for 20, 30 years, that got great pay, helped pay for college. And that's something else to think about. These jobs, these facilities, they do offer some economic positives, I suppose, to the region. They're stable jobs, they're good paying jobs. Now, there's a downside to it, of course. There's the environmental issues, there's the health issues. But there's also the economic to consider, which is that they're well paid.
I was thinking a lot about the roundtable on higher education that we had yesterday afternoon and the ways that this intersects with this. And obviously, we've talked a lot about the construction jobs and the union jobs, the sort of manufacturing, the blue collar jobs. Thinking about white collar jobs, that is there a consideration in locating these plants about where are nearby universities, where are engineering programs springing up? We talked about the rise of those engineering programs on all of these campuses in the Ohio Valley at this time, the chasing of federal research dollars. Is that integrated into these calculations about site selection?
No, that's interesting you bring it up. That's not a consideration with the site criteria that the AEC uses in the late 40s, early 50s. Primarily because these are seen as production. These are manufacturing. The one exception would be Mound, Mound and Scioto. But Mound is a research laboratory / production center. So it's a hybrid. But the rest of them, they're all considered manufacturing. They're all considered production facilities. Having said that, though, I mean, they certainly, I think, are interested in the fact that what is the available skilled labor force? Is that because you have very large unions and a large labor pool like Cincinnati, or it's interesting. They don't really define what they mean by the labor pool. They're just looking at strictly blue collar, white collar. What is that labor pool supposed to consist of? They don't define it. So the proximity to universities is not on their radar per se, but it certainly, I think, does help after the fact that once you've got Frenald up and running, once you've got Paducah up and running, once you've got Portsmouth or Miamisburg with Mound up and running, that you do have, college educated engineers that you could hire. Either National Lead would hire for Frenald, or Monsanto could hire for Mound, or Union Carbine could hire for Paducah. You've got those populations that you could hire and go straight from college right into management, into white collar jobs right there on site. So yeah, I think that becomes a bonus. But I think the reason why they don't take it into consideration initially is the fact that really had not been a consideration with the Manhattan Project. Hanford's out in the middle of southeastern Washington State, in the middle of nowhere. There's no colleges around there. Oak Ridge, yes, it's near Knoxville, and you've got University of Tennessee there, but again, it really wasn't a consideration. And Los Alamos, you're really, the closest you come is Santa Fe, is about 75 miles away, and Albuquerque is even further away. So I think because it had not been a consideration with the Manhattan Project, it really didn't get on the radar. But it is, I think, seen down the road as a bonus that we've got these facilities, and we have University of Cincinnati College of Engineering, we've got University of Illinois, University of Louisville, we've got University of Kentucky. We've got these established facilities, these institutions where we could draw engineering students from in internships or hire directly. No, I speaking as someone who has two cousins who are graduates of the Kentucky Community College engineering program in Paducah, which is, it's directly funneling in to those plants that continue on in that legacy and that expansion there. Yeah, it's absolutely real. I was fascinated as well by this transition from military run during the Manhattan Project era to the civilian run that we see in the post-war era. And I was thinking about, we're talking about site security, right? And are there Soviet agents sneaking around? And thinking about that, what sort of are they contracting that out to security firms? Are there guards here, or is there just like a chain link fence? And both. So obviously during the Manhattan Project, there are military personnel, military police, a special engineering detachment, SEDs, that are providing the security for Oak Ridge, for Hanford, for Los Alamos, for all of the major sites, even the minor ones. And when you go to civilian, that obviously does change. So you have civilian contractors providing the guard forces at these facilities, and that's one of the issues that the Atomic Energy Commission deals with almost from the very beginning is, what do we do? Do we want all personnel to be commission personnel, meaning federal employees? Or do we want to continue the practice that the Manhattan Project had, which was to have all these contractors and subcontractors and so on? The commissioners, and the first chairman of the commission is going to be David Lilienthal, former chairman of the Tennessee Valley Authority. Lilienthal and the other four, once they've done a tour of the complex that they've now inherited, and it'll be the last time that the commissioners, all the commissioners will take a tour of the entire complex at once, because they realize when they get back to DC that all it would have taken would have been one plane crash and the entire leadership of the Atomic Energy Commission would have been wiped out. So that was kind of an oops moment for them all. Lilienthal and the other commissioners are just simply overwhelmed at the size and scale of what they've now inherited. And then they start thinking about the nuts and bolts about this, about, okay, so how are we going to operate this? Are we going to make everyone federal employees? Well, good Lord, look at the size of this. Everyone's going to be, I mean, how are we going to do it? So they basically, after doing that tour, determined, okay, we're going to keep as much of the infrastructure, the system, the framework that the project had, we're going to keep that. So you have a veneer of federal oversight with lots of contractors and subcontractors. The security is an issue. What do we do about this? Are they federal? Are they contractor? Well, if we're following the model of the Manhattan Project and we're relying on contractors, there really should be contractors. And so at the sites, there are going to be contractor personnel. The guard forces are going to be contractor personnel. They're going to become highly skilled, highly trained. One of the biggest contractors for security within the AEC, and certainly when you go from the Atomic Energy Commission to the Department of Energy, is going to be Wackenhut. I don't know if you remember, Wackenhut, I think is still around, but Wackenhut at one point provided security. This is pre 9/11. Wackenhut once provided security at major airports around the country and at other federal installations. The guard forces are going to be highly trained, highly skilled, and basically they're trained to defend those facilities, maybe not to the death, but darn close to it. And they're heavily armed. They will become heavily armed. The guard force at Hanford by the 1980s will have attack choppers, armored personnel carriers, SWAT caliber weapons, highly trained. The same thing with the guard force at the Rocky Flats facility outside of Denver, another AEC facility built in the 50s. Yeah, the security is going to be contracted, but highly trained, highly skilled, and heavily armed, and really only responsible to the first the AEC and then the Department of Energy.
That's really reminiscent. I've known some folks, some veterans even today, who are working in private security in DoD installations.
Yeah.
But yeah, very much that same reality still continues in these sort of hybrid contract governmental installations still today.
Now, back to the first part of your question about what with the state of security in the early 50s. State of security wasn't exactly the greatest at times. So Commissioner Lewis Strauss, part of the original five, Lewis Strauss will make a trip out to see Mound. This is after the big tour. He'll make a trip out to see Mound and what's happening at Mound. He'll get out to Mound and be absolutely appalled at the fact that, okay, you've got the construction site where the Mound facility is being built, and yet there is a tourist stairway going up to the top of the nearby Native American burial mound, and you still have people being permitted to go up to the top of the burial, and they've got a clear view, a great view of everything happening at the nearby AEC facility. He just kind of is dumbfounded by this, like, wait a minute. Wait, this is supposed to be a top secret facility. It's right next door. I understand that, but why are you still allowing people to go up? And there's not even a guard there. It's just wide open. He's completely floored by it. He just, and I've done some research on Louis Strauss, and he's a former rear admiral, service during World War II. He also becomes one of the biggest critics of J. Robert Oppenheimer, and is partially responsible for Oppenheimer being stripped of his security clearance. So Louis Strauss, I can just imagine a scene with Louis Strauss just going ballistic, going, "What do you mean you can go up to the top of this?" But the construction is right there, and now you've got a bird's eye view of everything.
Right.
Where's the security at? Well, slight oversight.
Absolutely.
So it wasn't perfect.
We are right at an hour, and I know we've got another presentation starting at 11:30. I wanted to thank you again for this wonderful presentation. I have been riveted the entire time. Thank you for raising really fascinating questions. One of the ones that I didn't get to ask you was about reckoning with these total costs, these environmental costs. Stay tuned, because at 11:30 we're gonna focus on the legacies of Rubbertown in Louisville and how those environmental costs get reckoned with. So join us for that one. Thank you, Jason, for everything that you have done to help recruit and bring this group of presentations together. I so greatly appreciate it.
Well, thank you, and thank everyone who attended, and definitely hope to see everyone again at the 11:30 one. So thank you all.
All right, we'll see everybody soon.